So, if you're not interested in my personal ramblings, you may want to skip this particular video. I'm just going to talk about basically some thoughts on getting older and how interesting that is, and also how liberating it can be as well. So, if you're not interested in that, then, as I said, you might want to skip this. So it's an interesting thing, getting older. It's funny how in your 20s, and this is, I'm just speaking from my own experience, but also some friends of mine, and other people may have a totally different experience, but in your 20s you sort of can feel like you're sort of invincible in a way, that you're never ever really going to get older. It's just sort of, and things move a lot slower when you're in your 20s, because everything's new, and also there's a lot of there's interest in forming new relationships, whether they're sexual ones or they're just friendships, and interest in new people and travel, and so everything is kind of different and new. And so time seems to go slower, and it feels like in some ways it can feel like you're always going to be young. You're always going to be that age, and people are always going to be interested in you, really. As you know, we live in a culture in the West where younger people are of more interest, and even the medical profession takes more interest in young people, meaning they take more interest in their health, whereas when you're older, they kind of expect you to have illnesses and diseases, which is something that is kind of strange, because if we were eating a plant-based diet, that probably wouldn't be so much the case, but that's what the medical profession expect. But anyway, when you're younger, and you'd really, most people are sort of healthy, I guess, unless they're eating lots of rubbish. And of course, animal products haven't caught up to you yet, so, your body can kind of handle it. And so you're basically, you're trotting along and you kind of feel very healthy and you've got lots of energy. And then there's this period where I notice that people get to about 30 years old. And I've seen this online, where you notice there's certain YouTube influencers, they get to the 30 mark and then they start to feel concerned. They start to worry, because I think they see, or they realize, that society starts to lose interest in people. I'm not saying all of society, but a certain amount of society, and mainstream culture loses interest in people over a certain age. They start to lose interest. And so you see these sort of, YouTube influencers that have just reached, say, 30 years old, and they say they start to feel old, and they start to get concerned. So then there's this period between, say, 30 and 40 where that concern probably continues for some people. I personally haven't really much interest in or care. I didn't really have much concern about getting older, because I was already an outsider in the LGBT community, so I always felt like an outsider, and society kind of treats you that way implicitly with the heteronormative culture, and the advertising has been, in decades past, and it still is mostly focused on, heterosexuals and binary genders, etc. So it's like, I already felt like an outsider. So, I was already fairly invisible in society in a way. But for people that aren't, for people that are heterosexual or whatever, and white, they start to get a sense of, when they start moving into their 30s, that even though they're part of the mainstream culture, they're being less and less taken being given attention. And then, of course, it only goes, in some ways, goes downhill from there. But there's this small gap between 20 and 35. Society still pays attention to you. But then after that, after about 35 on to 50, you notice that it's getting less and less. And then 50 onwards, it sort of becomes that you're sort of, in some ways, really becoming invisible and irrelevant. How do I know that? Because you can see it. You can see the way generally people's attitudes change. And when you get into closer to 60, where I am now, people actually seem to look through you almost. It's an interesting phenomena, and it's actually very good for the ego, really, in a way, because if you had any ego at all, which we all do, if you have any ego at all, when people start to look through you and they don't see you as an individual anymore, and I'm generalizing here, they don't see you as an individual anymore, they start to see you as an old person, unfortunately, then they sort of, any of your history becomes erased. It's like your history is completely irrelevant. And back to, people when they're in between 20 and 35, that's probably the golden years where you're still relevant in society, in this very sort of commodified society where youth is commodified and it's like a new product every year, new celebrities every year, a new young person, yada yada, and that seems to spill over into everyday life. And as I said, I'm generalizing here. It's an interesting phenomena that there's this short window for everybody, for a lot of people in Western society, of about 15 years, maybe if they're lucky 20, where they're sort of youthful and people pay attention to them, and they're seen as sort of they're seen as having potential to do things. And then after that, they're sort of, it's like next, and then they become sort of more irrelevant to this whole youth culture, the whole commodification of youth and everything that goes with that. It's such a small period of time, really, 15 to 20 years. After you leave school, 20 to 35, possibly if you're lucky 40, up to 40, but probably more like 15. And it's a very short period of time where you can feel youthful and vital and sort of like the focus of society in Western society. And also, for women, those sort of reproductive years, if you're interested in that. Of course, that's not necessary for women to do that, of course, but just mentioning it. And so it's interesting, isn't it, in one's life in Western society, that's kind of where it's at, that 15 years. 15 years to sort of be seen as sort of relevant and of interest and focus. And then after that, it's not like that. And that's where I think people, that's, in some ways, even though it's sad that that's how it is, because everybody, no matter what age, should be viewed as a person, an individual, and of worth, and that they have interests and likes and dislikes, etc., and that they're valuable no matter how able they are or whatever. It's not, it doesn't matter what they look like. That should be how it is, but it's not like that. But the good thing about becoming irrelevant to a capitalist society that is youth-oriented is that you then have to rely completely on yourself, and your ego is challenged because if you're not seen as sort of important in any way, if you're not seen as something that can be still used or has potential. Of course, everybody has potential no matter what age, but I'm just saying the capitalist system. If you're not seen as being useful in some way and generating income or generating something, then you become sort of you're sort of pushed to the side in a way. And that only increases every decade until when you get to, say, around my age, that's when it really becomes evident that you're of little interest, even to, even medical professionals will sort of expect that people of this age are going to have, problems, medical problems, instead of sort of thinking that that's something that shouldn't be happening if we were actually eating properly and exercising and everything, but that's what they expect. And I remember when I was when I turned 30, I had a bunch of different life problems, different life crises, events that happened one after the other. Losing a significant relationship. At the same time, I lost my job because I injured my back, and I couldn't do that for quite a while because I had to work on my back. I'd injured it in nursing in Melbourne, and then after I lost my job, I lost my significant relationship after that, and I think that was partly because I lost my job, which is really unfortunate. And then and that included that there was a child involved in that relationship of the person I was with, and so I lost that relationship. They didn't keep in touch. I was in a band before I injured my back. That I ended that because after 5 years, I just didn't think that was working for me. It wasn't a good fit. So there was some other things too. So there was a number of things, including losing my health by having a back injury that I had to go into hospital for. I didn't have an operation, but I had to go into hospital and have some traction. And I would tell you a Seinfeldian type thing that happened while I was in the hospital, but maybe another time. Anyway, so, when you have a number of kind of big life sort of changes in situation that happened to me then, there's a whole number of identities that are taken away from you. And you're no longer in a relationship, you're no longer with that person, and you have to go through that grieving of the loss of that person. And then you are no longer a singer-songwriter in a band, and it's something you've been doing for a while, so that identity is taken away from you. You're no longer a nurse because you've injured your back and you've had to go on compensation for that, and they just kind of shoved me out to pasture, if I can use a speciesist term, and there wasn't really any interest in any sort of rehab to get me back into nursing, even though I sort of did later on, but that was after a few years of not being able to do it. So, there was a whole different losses of identity, and I became very depressed. Then I unfortunately got involved in got together with someone who turned out to be domestically violent, a perpetrator of domestic violence. So that was, on top of everything else, and that's probably because I had low self-esteem at the time. So, you end up making bad choices. So there was a number of things all crunched into about 2 or 3 years. So this was, around 30 years old, and so all those different, identities are taken away. So you're basically I was basically kind of stripped of identity, really. And then you realize I didn't realize how much I was invested in those different identities. You don't realize, because they become a part of you if you've been doing something, if you've been doing nursing for a long time or being in a band, all those different things. If you've been doing all those things and then they're suddenly gone, then you realize, oh wow, So who am I if I'm not those particular things? And even though I had a fairly strong sense of self, really, and I've always been very comfortable being by myself, I didn't realize until I lost them that they provided me with a certain way of being in the world. So when those things went, suddenly I was not those things, and then, it was that was very challenging and very confronting. And then, of course, the violence, even though it was a short-lived relationship, that domestically violent situation, and I managed to get out of that, that left me with very low self-esteem after that. If my self-esteem wasn't already low, then that made it much lower. It was kind of rock bottom. And that's when I sought out some therapy, and that's when I got very depressed and sought out some therapy. But at the same time, then I came across, now if you're not interested in spiritual stuff, this is the time to opt out of this. I decided that I would look into Buddhism. So I went along to a Buddhist teaching. I first of all I was having therapy, but I went along to a Buddhist teaching, and I found that to be, I didn't find the religion. In the end, I find organized religions are very problematic, but Buddhist philosophy is very helpful. And so I found that to be, for all the stripping away of the various identities I had. Then I sort of got involved in Buddhism in a fairly regular and ongoing way. And I probably took that to an extreme in that I decided to be a monastic for a few years, and that wasn't probably the best idea for me. But you can only try and be something that you find that you are drawn to. And so that's what I did. And so I went to India and I was ordained by the Dalai Lama. I don't endorse the Dalai Lama now because he's come out with some really odd things about refugees, and there's other problems too. But I mean, he's a very compassionate being at the same time, but I'm not sure what's going on with him. Some of the things he's said is kind of wacky, and maybe it's time for him to retire, I don't know. But anyway, but at the time, that's what I did, so that's what I did. I went to McLeod Ganj in Himachal Pradesh, and I was ordained and did all that. But there was really no support in that with Western monastics. It's really not something that's supported. Tibetan monastics, it's a different story. But Western ones is not, and I still think that that's still a problem. And I remember somebody in Himachal Pradesh in one of the monasteries, a Western monastic, saying to me, the only reason you will probably disrobe, the only reason people usually disrobe is because they don't get adequate support. And well, he was right, because I didn't really get adequate support as a monastic, and I sort of couldn't, there just isn't support, even in a financial sense, there isn't. And so I was doing part-time work, doing medical transcription, but that's really not what it should have been like. I mean, in India, in northern India, Tibetan nuns, Buddhist nuns, they have a lot more support. They have a monastic setup, a nunnery, and it's fairly structured, and they get support from the community, from what I understand. But Western monastics, it's not like that, and I don't think that has improved, as I've said, so that's really unfortunate. So you're always going to get people not feeling supported and then having to disrobe, as they call it, because they feel they can't sustain it. So this is something I've never really talked about before, but I thought I'd talk about it because very rarely ever talk about myself on this channel, so I thought I would just do a sort of a personal piece to give anybody who's interested a little idea of my background, and also just my thoughts about life. And you may not be interested at all in this, but I mean, everybody's got a story, right? And it informs what we think and our motivations, etc. But one thing, that is a theme in my life is that I've never been particularly hung up on identities anyway, really. I've kind of floated through life in a way, sort of wondering why things are the way they are. I've sort of, when I say floated, I've kind of never quite felt that I belonged. I'd never really understood the way things are structured. Initially, in my early 20s, I just took it for granted, the way things were set up, but as time went by, I didn't really see the point in it. I didn't see the point in how things were set up, why people were doing jobs that they hated or that they didn't get any fulfillment from, why people would, sort of getting themselves into debt so quickly, why everybody thought they had to have children. Just all these sort of norms that, I mean, we're all individuals and we're not little cookie cutter cutouts that have to follow along this prescribed path. And I never really understood why people, I mean, of course, everybody has different levels of debt, and some people cannot do, what they would like to do in life. Some people are afraid to take that chance, or they can't take that chance, or, there's all sorts of reasons why people don't take chances. But I've always sort of thought, life, you only have one life. I've always tried to do things that I thought were important at the time, even though to the chagrin of my family and relatives who've never particularly liked anything that I've done. I've always, I did an arts degree at university in my early 30s, and that was very interesting. And, there are all these different things that, if you're interested in something and you are really driven, if there's any way that you can do it, please, one should try and do it if that's possible. Like, I went traveling in my early 20s to the US and to Europe. That was great fun, and it was really, I did that by myself. I started off with 2 other people, but they were very, very straight and seemed to be totally focused on meeting men, and I wasn't really that interested for obvious reasons. And then so I decided to go off by myself, and I just had the best time. And I sort of spent some time in a village in the Netherlands and with some lovely people, and I did all these different things that I wanted to do, and spent some time in a lovely Mariapfarr in Austria, a little tiny village. It was just this picturesque village that you would imagine, that you see in postcards. Snow everywhere, a little steeple, a little tiny village, and we all, there was this great hall they all went to and drank schnapps. Just great things like that. And I spent a lot of time just by myself going around, and I didn't really have any fear of anything then, really. And I remember this wonderful woman when I went to Berlin, and I arrived and I was too early and I didn't have any Deutschmarks, so I was waiting for the bank to open at the train station, and this black woman came up to me, and I was sitting on the steps and I was really tired, and she came up to me and she realized I must have been waiting to get some money from the bank, and it hadn't opened, so she just gave me some money to catch a bus to the hostel. And I think she gave me an orange or something. She gave me some food, which I thought was incredibly nice, and I've always remembered that. And that's something I try to do when we have hitchhikers here in Tasmania. We tend to pick them up, drop them off in the local town, and sometimes I give them some money, like $20 to have lunch or something. And the thing about doing that is, and I'm getting right away now from the irrelevance, how irrelevant one starts to get when one gets older. But anyway, I may not get back to that, but I'm off on a tangent. So, but that's the thing about doing small kindnesses for people. I want to give people some hope. I try to give people some sort of hope in humanity. There's so much that's going wrong today. So much that is dysfunctional, and everybody's trying to make ends meet and scrabbling, and capitalism is just run amok, and neoliberalism is just run amok, and people are just really, really stressed, basically. People are stressed. So I try and do things where people can't do anything back. They can't pay me back, basically. They can't. It's sort of like doing things for people where there's no way they can repay you, if you know what I mean. And that, I sort of feel like that sort of gives people some sort of faith in humanity, that there's kindness without looking for something in return. And I get a great deal of pleasure from, and I'm not trying to sort of pat myself on the back or bring any, trying to make myself seem like some good person. I'm not saying that, but I'm just trying to say that doing things for people, particularly when they don't know it, is such a good thing to do, particularly when they're not aware of it. You do something for people, or if they are aware of it and they can't pay you back. I know it feels really good, and I think it helps enhance society, because there's, like I say, there's so much suffering, there's so much sort of everything. We're nickel and dime to death, basically. Like I was just saying to someone the other day, how just going to the vet now, I mean, you expect that they're going to charge you to sit in the chair soon, and maybe that's even covered, wear and tear on the chairs. I mean, every single thing that, just that the price that they put on things is like, sort of like, the markup is ridiculous on things. Everything is becoming out of range. I mean, I sort of live on a kind of a really shoestring budget sort of thing. And, to the point where I share a coffee with my partner, or we'll share a burger. We can't really afford to be buying coffees every day. And then when we do buy a coffee, we'll go halves in it. It's that sort of thing. And so, it's like, in America, people can't afford that $500 bill. If something comes up that's an emergency, they don't have the money for it. Well, we've been in that position for a long time now, and most of my life I've sort of been living a kind of a week-to-week kind of thing. The cats whom I live with never ever have had to worry about. There were times where my last bits of money would be on, food for my beloved cats, whereas I would be sort of not doing so well in sort of making reaching the end of that time and getting by. But I certainly my cats never ever went without. But anyway, this isn't a hard luck story. There are people, of course, that are in much dark, particularly now with neoliberalism in full swing. In the 80s it wasn't so bad, and then I just saw it getting worse and worse, neoliberalism, and how it affected people's jobs, and how people started getting into debt more and more in Australia. So, I was lucky in a way that at least it wasn't as bad in the 80s and 90s as it has been since the 2000s and now. So I had a little tiny bit of respite from the grueling and grinding neoliberalism of today. But still, when you've experienced what it's like before neoliberalism started, which I have had some experience, and you see what it's like now, I think it's a monstrosity. I think it's an abomination what's happening to people right now. It's just so wrong, and it's really robbing people of being able to do the kinds of things that they would like to do, and that I probably wouldn't have been able to do had I been born, say, 30 years later. I wouldn't have been probably able to afford to go overseas and, go and visit different countries. I probably wouldn't have even been able to afford to be in a band. It's harder and harder for people to do artistic things and performance things and all of that. So it's like I was very fortunate in that way, that I had that small window where I was able to do some things. Even being monastic, in the 90s, that was something that maybe I couldn't have done if I was born much later, because it's just the insecurity of that is just too great, in a financial sense. But just back to, losing one's identity when things are stripped away. Now I'm going to talk about some spiritual stuff now that, like I say, if you're offended by anything spiritual, then you may want to tune out with this, but this is just my experience of now. And as I say, when you get to a certain age, when you're getting into the last third of your life, as I am, people start to, you become completely invisible, particularly as a woman. And I think women handle that better than men do. I think a lot of men are more kind of attached to the identity of their work, and so when they start to experience the same kind of invisibility that, say, women do in the last phase of their life, they start to, it really can badly affect men. Not all men, but it can affect men badly, and I think that sometimes contributes to early death, just lack of being valued, feeling irrelevant and all of that. And probably also that there was probably a time where they were the center of attention, which can be the case. But anyway, but the good thing about sort of becoming that, there's a good side to that ageism, and you have to look for the good, right? There's a good side to that ageism, and that is that it's another kind of loss of it's another hit to the ego. Like I say, there was that time in the 30s, very stripping away of those things that I identified with, and then you are losing, to some extent, you start to lose your youthful looks, which that happens from when you're from probably 40 onwards. You start to lose your youthful looks, and you can see that going away, and then people start to see you as almost like irrelevant in society, as irrelevant as a contributor, even though you might be doing lots of volunteer work. The fact that you're not being paid, people don't value that. Some people do, and some parts of society value the volunteer stuff, but I mean, when you're not a paid worker, somehow you're not seen as so valuable anymore. So then, even though I'm busy all the time and I do lots of different things, it sort of doesn't really matter to people aren't that interested really, and that's okay. That's fine. In fact, it's a good thing, because the less interested people are in me, the more I don't care really. It's like I don't even care anymore what I ceased caring about what people thought of me quite a few years ago, and that's very liberating. And once you really and truly don't care anymore what people think of you, and I don't mean not caring if people, I don't mean, then you can just start behaving badly and all of that, and I don't mean that. I just mean when you're just doing what you sort of think is important, and if people can't handle it, that's okay. If they can, well, that's great. If I talk about something on this channel and people aren't interested in it, well, that's okay, because I'm interested in it, and there'll be somebody that will be interested in it. Like this somebody might find this particular episode interesting, and some other people might think, Christ, what is she talking about? And why does she think I'd be interested in this? she's old, so why would I be interested in what she's got to say? That kind of thing. And that's okay, totally okay. So the thing about when you get to the point where you start to become invisible in society and people just kind of look through you, they kind of look at you just like you're an old person kind of thing. It's actually quite liberating. And when I was going to talk about something spiritual, I was reading this book. I've followed occasionally Eckhart Tolle, the author and the guy that he speaks on. You can see him on YouTube. He talks about living in the present, being in the present. And I mention this occasionally on my when I do these thoughts episodes about being in the now. I've just been listening to an Audible recording of him narrating his book, The Power of Now. I found that to be very interesting, and it kind of reminds me of Buddhist philosophy, but it's kind of really gets to the point, and there's no sort of religious iconography and all of that stuff, the different things that one can get with Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism. It doesn't have any of that, but it sort of talks about the power of being in the now and how not living in the future and not dwelling in the past, not ruminating in the past, because all we have is the present, really. That's all we have. There is nothing else but the present. And so if we're living fully in the present, then we're not really worrying about the future. We're being in the present. And really, unless there's something attacking you in the present, if you're living fully in that moment, then there's nothing really to fear. I'm not going to try and explain what that book's about, because it's very profound, and I would invite people to check it out. And also, if you're living in the present, and you're being fully in the present every moment, which sometimes I can do that, and other times I find my mind's going off in various directions. It's almost like a walking meditation, and that can bring a lot of calm and peace into one's life, and also can open up and look with fresh eyes on everything around oneself, including people. And then you're not fixing anybody into a permanent state. And of course, I still get angry, and I get very upset about the way the world is going, because it's creating so much unnecessary suffering, the powers that be. But I also try and ground myself in the fact that there's only so much one can do to try and change things. But if we're all trying to do that in our own small way, then that can be very powerful. But we can also try and remain in the present, and with that comes a lot of, the more we're in the present, the more there's the ability for real love and compassion and sort of a wisdom to grow. And it's an ongoing effort. We're all works in progress. And I find, because of life experiences and stuff, and you get an overall view of how sometimes when you're younger, you sort of it's not like a cancel culture thing, but I mean, when people do stuff, you kind of write them off, because and you fix them at this particular time. You look at them even years later as somebody that's fixed in time like that and will always be like that, which is often not the case. People change all the time. I'm a totally different person many times over to what I was in my early 20s, which brings me to just the point too of how, because now young people, they document everything they say and do. I'm not saying everybody does, but a lot of young people do. There are things that if I had been documenting myself in my 20s or late teens, I would have said some naff things too, because we're all growing and we're all learning. And I feel very sad for young people today that that do document everything, and then then it's like a permanent record on the internet. But that's not really how people actually are. People are not. We're not permanent. We're always changing. Even our body, the cells are changing and refreshing. Everything is changing, and really we're just molecules in space. Everything is just molecules, basically. So we're all just changing, and physically and mentally, psychologically, that we're changing in so many different ways, and society is changing. And so, it's just sort of like, I just feel sad for young people that, there's these permanent records, and then people drag it up, decades later, and sort of, crucify people for things that they said 15 years ago when they've apologized and changed and all of that. So that's, I don't know, I'm all over the place, really. I don't really have a particular point in this, except that life is fascinating, and I hope that I get to live another 20 or so years, even though I know things are going to get dire with the climate crisis and, possible imminent human extinction in 2050, possibly, or 2060. But I find the whole going through life and seeing how it plays out, and looking at younger people and thinking, you have that certain period of time where you'll probably be feeling relevant in the center of the universe, and then you have to start adjusting psychologically to the fact that it's not really like that. And that's when I think really interesting things happen to people in their life, as far as their ego goes, because ego can be a real obstruction. The more we kind of feel we're important, the more problematic we can make it for ourselves and others. And as time goes by, when those things get taken from you and stripped away, and it just only gets more and more stripped away as you get older. But that can be either pushed against and great resistance to that, which causes more suffering, or we can just accept all of that as it happens. Just like, animals are wonderful examples of just accepting things as they are every moment. Like as Eckhart Tolle said, he was living with some Zen masters who were cats, who would just basically, they would accept whatever happened in that moment from moment to moment. I lived with a cat like that too. Cats are like that, but I lived with a cat who was a great spiritual teacher, basically. His name was Sajan. We got him when he was 12 years old. He was adopted when he was 12. He had some health issues that we helped him through. He had diabetes pretty much as soon as we got him, and we used to give him injections every day. And there wasn't one, from the moment we got him till his death, he just accepted every moment. He was just the most wonderful being, and he never resisted anything. He was just everything that happened, he accepted it as it happened. And he was a lovely individual, and I'll always remember him. We had him for 5 years, and if we hadn't adopted him, he would have probably been dead in a couple of years, or a year even, with the diabetes. So he had 5 extra years, and he lived till he was 17. There's all sorts of lessons in life. There's all sorts of people. I'll never forget that woman that gave me that orange and gave me that money to get to the hostel. It was a brief meeting, but I'll never forget her, and that was 1983. And I still can see her face, this black woman, and she was so kind to me. Life is a fascinating thing. It really is. And yet it's so different for different people. Like, I'm a white person living in Australia, and then yet I try not to torture myself too much about the suffering of like Palestinians and stuff, but it's impossible not to be aware of things like that. And the people in Yemen who are starving and dying of diseases. And I think, why is all this going on one planet when it doesn't have to be like that? Why are we in such dysfunction at such a late stage when we could be extinct? And then I think, well, that's why we're going extinct, really, because we don't even know how to look after our nest, and we can't stop exploiting and killing animals and eating and using and wearing them. We can't stop that. We don't seem to be able to get out of our own way. We can't even see the paradise that we have here right now. We're always looking for more and more, commodifying everything. Capitalism is such a dreadful thing, but we're drivers of capitalism. But anyway, I'm sure there are some of you who might be able to relate to some stories. There are things that are real ego destroyers that can happen, and they might seem like they're devastating at the time, but in fact it turns out they were very good things and actually opened a door to something else. That literally is what happens. It opens a door to something that's probably in some ways a lifesaver in a different way. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes people can't handle it. The burden is too heavy, and that's a terrible thing as well. I'm just prattling on, but I thought I would mention those things maybe sometime. I'll talk more in depth about some of those things, but I just thought I would share a bit about myself. And I find, it's good to connect with people on a personal level, because, we're all just trying to go through this life, trying to be happy, and sometimes trying to be happy can cause suffering for other people. Even the people that are creating a lot of the suffering, even these people like US politicians, and like George W. Bush and all of those people, as much as, they cause suffering and it's terrible, I don't wish any unhappiness on these people, really. I don't. And I think in a way that people who cause so much suffering for other people, the immediate effects of that is that they, and I won't use punishment, karma isn't punishment, it's just how things happen. It's not a judgment punishment thing, but their immediate karma in a way is, and I don't even really particularly believe in karma even, but the immediate results of being like that and causing so much suffering for others is they don't have empathy. They lack empathy, and they lack compassion, and they lack a sense of real justice. And that in itself is a punishment, really, to go through life and not have empathy for others. I think that is a punishment, because I would imagine that you can't fully feel love and fully feel life if you can't feel empathy. So that's something we can think about when we see these people doing all sorts of horrible things to vast masses of people. That it may seem that they never ever get justice, that justice is never served to them. But really, in a way, they are their own punishment in that they do not have empathy. And they therefore do not really fully experience love for others, and that, I think, is a terrible, terrible way to be. Anyway, thanks for listening to me kind of waffle on. I was making a point in the beginning, but then it got lost. Anyhow, so thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're